Welcome to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Mike Roderick, and today we're doing our CEH version 9. And specifically in this episode, we're going to be taking a look at information security controls, as well as some security laws and standards that we need to be familiar with for our CEH. And here to help us with that, of course, is Mr. Adam Gordon. How you doing, Adam?
Good, good. I'm feeling very legal and very constrained, but also suspiciously somehow emboldened a line today. We'll see how all that goes, but let's see if we can be regulatory and compliant in the same sentence. We'll see how that comes out as well. So we're going to talk a bit about information security controls, talk about some of the standards, the regulatory compliance concerns we would have as a certified ethical hacker. What is information assurance? Why is it important? Why should we care? The answer is forthcoming soon in the following episode. All right, so information assurance. Let's talk a bit about the idea behind IA, what it means for us as ethical hackers, or indeed just as security professionals, to think about information assurance. When we think about governance, risk, and compliance, we think about GRC activities in the organization. We have to think about the point people that help us manage risk, assess our level of compliance, and the value and indeed the adherence to the governance regimes we have put in place, and whether we are aligned or not, and whether we are compliant or not, and whether we have the proper oversight or not, are very important concerns. And information assurance, or something like that role, we may see a CRO, a chief risk officer, emerging today. We see in some cases in the government and the military area, more formal reference to a specific IA, information assurance role, separate from risk management, separate from other things. We may see generically a chief compliance officer, a CCO in the organization, in the private sector. There's different ways to think about this, but ultimately these roles are responsible for integrity, are responsible for confidentiality, are responsible for availability of information, the specification of the controls, the oversight, the monitoring, the management, and the validation of those inside of the organization with regards to that level of not only adherence in the information management, but also the use of information day to day. The IA role is about making sure that we have a set of standards, typically aligned with policy, driven through, monitored by, and implemented as a result of policy being translated through the organization into process and procedure, and then being able to continuously monitor that and assess the value of that information flow or that management oversight in the organization. So information assurance is all about making sure that we do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons, and that we have validation, we have proof of that, most importantly. So it's very, very critical for us to have policy, have process, procedure, and guidance developed and broadly communicated among all the members of the organization that are going to touch those systems. One of the places where we often fall down on the job as a CEH and or as more broadly, just generically a security professional, is not about creating the policies. The policies usually are there. They come from senior management more often than not, and are going to be a statement of intent at a high level, a more strategic focus level of the organization. Where we tend to break down is where we try to translate that policy into something that is tangible, that is understood by the masses, that is consumed by them, and that is standardized for the organization. The application of policy through process and procedure, in other words, is where we often break down, and the broad communication around that to create awareness of the responsibility through due care and due diligence, terms that are very important for you to be aware of, and vocabulary terms that you should practice using and put into practice in the organization with regards to risk management. If you're not able, as a security professional today, to understand how to define due care and due diligence, you're not doing your job. And if you're not able to define those terms with regards to the things you do every day and understand tangible examples of due care and due diligence in your world, you're not doing your job. I don't care what you do. I don't care how well you do it. You are not doing the things you need to do to be risk aware and to be able to manage risk down, mitigated in the organization. Very important concepts that you have to learn how to communicate broadly and widely throughout the organization with regards to security awareness. The most important thing we can do with regards to IA is to broadly and widely create awareness and a culture of security that must be created to transmit this in the organization. Mike, help me play a game if you don't mind.
Sure.
You were looking a little bored there for a minute. I thought I'd bring you back in. Mike was getting ready to go update his Facebook status. I'm bored. That was what he was going to say while Adam's talking. So let's play a game for just a second, shall we? So how in an organization, you've worked in the private sector outside of this particular company that we are both doing some work for this week. For as you and I have chatted many times over the time we spent together, we both have a long history in the private sector doing this kind of work for various organizations. What are some things that if you were in charge of IA, if you had to create an IA program and an awareness program in an organization, what are some of the steps? What are some of the things you may do to help drive that?
I would say first and foremost would be just training, education for my employees.
Okay, so you'd want to create some sort of information security management or awareness program, right? Just generically create some sort of security awareness training program and show people, right? Tell people and do for people by example what it is you want them to do. Okay, so we would do that, definitely. That would be good. Are there specific things we may do in that program? There's probably a lot of different things we could do, right?
Oh, absolutely. You know, training, well, like the example we talked about in another episode where somebody was requested and then emailed electronic information.
W2, W9s.
Yes,
oh, yeah, that was a
absolutely.
biggie. That was not a good day.
And I think with the proper training and education, and if our users were made aware, they would realize that that was definitely a no-no.
All right. A formal security term, by the way. That is the proper term. Only when you are certified can you use no-no as a formal term. Otherwise, it's a boo-boo or an ouchie, one or the other. So, yes, very, very important, right? We would want to do and focus on awareness around some of those tangible things. We may want to look at a concept, and we can kind of roll the things Mike was just talking about up into two concepts. One, something known as threat modeling. So we may want to look at threat modeling and think through and understand the impact of essentially the what-if scenario, right? And that's really what threat modeling is. What would happen if this threat or this issue was to be faced by the organization? How would we respond? What would that look like? What would we do? We'd want to think about identifying the objectives. You know, what are the things we want to protect against? What are the things we want to potentially envision could happen? Think about them, model them out, you know, go through and ask the questions, look at the scenario, figure out what would happen, and then come up with a plan to mitigate that. So threat modeling is very, very important. We look at it as part of an extension of the risk assessment approach that we have to have in the organization to manage risks. So linking the concept of threat modeling to risk assessment, very important in what Mike was saying with regards to security awareness and training, very important for you as you look to ultimately study for and be successful at pursuing the CEH certification. Want to make sure we understand that. So we think about threat modeling a little bit, right? Analyzing the potential opportunities that are in front of us and thinking about the responses we would have and crafting and tailoring those plans, those programs, those responses to match and indeed to best those risks that we would find. We'd also want to link it to a second concept, that and something we've talked about already that I've mentioned, which is broader in scope, which is the enterprise security architecture, sometimes called the enterprise information security architecture, either ESA or EISA as an acronym, because we're always very big on the alphabet soup here at ITPro TV/information security. That would be ITPro TV/IS. I don't know if there's an acronym that we could actually. ITPro TV is right, something. I don't know.
There is now.
There is now, right? Exactly. So, but you know, with information security, we're very big on acronyms. I often said when I grew up that the job that I've wanted would be to sit somewhere in that mythical office, wherever it exists, and be the person who throws the darts at the balloon line walls, coming up with the acronyms, the three-letter acronyms that we use to represent everything. I envisioned it would be called the TLA, the three-letter acronym office of the TLAO. And I would be the EVP of the TLAO. That would be my job, and I would sit and throw darts at the wall all day, and then, of course, come up with crazy, stupid, no-nonsensical names for things that really don't matter. But that would be important, because that's what you do, right? So further propagating the inanity of information security. That's what I was hoping to do when I grew up. Didn't quite work out that way, but I'm convinced somewhere in the world there is a position that actually does that. I just haven't been able to find the right job description to respond to it yet.
It's at Microsoft.
You know, that or the Pentagon, one or the other, because they are masters. And there actually is an office in all defense establishments that actually does this specific thing. But they actually admit that. They actually have an office that does nothing but this. Software companies like Microsoft don't admit it. They just hide it in the bowels of the organization. But anyway, we digress. So with regards to information or enterprise information security architecture, the other point that Mike made that we want to draw out and bring up is that we can roll this up as part of the security awareness and training into this concept of creating the ESA or the EISA and formally institutionalizing the knowledge necessary to create the strategic statements of intent, the policy, and then guide them and implement them through process and policy with a directive and an overarching sense of idea and execution, which is the ESA, the Enterprise Security Architecture, or the ISA, the Enterprise Information Security Architecture. It determines the structure and behavior of the organization's information systems with regards to processing, security, and all the things associated with it. We should be able to create this, standardize it, and communicate it broadly throughout the organization. There are international standards that may help us to do this. We'll talk about some of them coming up, but things like ISO 27001 and ISO 27002. For instance, the ISO 27001 and 27002 standards last revised in 2013. So you would see them listed as ISO 27001:2013 for the year. You always see the year referenced with an ISO standard to signify the last time the standard was revised and the last publication date of the standard. ISO 27001:2013 deals with the establishment of the ISMS, the Information Security Management System. And ISO 27002 is the set of controls that are applied to the ISMS in 27001, allowing us to structure, build, and operate the ISMS throughout the organization, creating an enterprise security architecture as we go. So it would be very important for us to be able to understand how to do something like this. We may use elements specified in ISO 15408, the Common Criteria Standard, which allows us to go out and consume certain information systems that have been tested and have been essentially profiled and specified to offer a certain level of protection based on something known as the assurance evaluation, or the evaluation assurance level. I always get those backwards. The EAL. EAL 5, for instance, right? A certified system at EAL 5 is going to offer protection higher than a level 4 or level 3 system, but not as high as level 6 or level 7. There are a total of 7 levels in that protection scheme. And so there's a lot of different moving parts that we may implement here from the international standard, if we are, from the ISO perspective, in other words, if we're looking at guidance specific to an organization, but maybe not at the level of ISO. We may look to an organization like NIST and may find guidance there with some of the recommendations that NIST provides. Not recommendations that are legally binding, but best practice common sense recommendations that could be integrated into an enterprise information or enterprise security architecture. Things like standards for logging, things like standards for patch management, things like standards for the application of encryption and cryptography protections to our organization, the use of secure encryption protocols or encryption-oriented tunneling protocols to create security through VPNs, the use of the protections that are offered, or the controls that are offered in NIST 800-53R4, which are the control elements associated with the implementation of FIPS guidance in the United States government, for instance, Federal Information Processing Standards. There's all these different ways we can go. We may not look to governmental recommendations, things like PCI DSS, which are, again, standards. They are called standards, although they are not regulatory and legally binding at the same way that HIPAA standards would be in the United States, which are law and must be followed under the direct penalty of legal and or financial and legal ramifications if you are found to be in violation. You and I were just talking about this before we got started, right? And PCI DSS is one of those areas that a lot of people don't really understand well. They think that it is a law, that you must follow this or else. PCI DSS guidance is not a law, not in the United States, not anywhere in the world. What it says is that it is a collection of recommended 12, in this case, in the current version 3.02, 12 implementation practices. They are called standards. They are essentially guidelines that anybody that wants to process electronic payments, deal with EDIFACT data, electronic gateway transactions, things like that in the payment industry, and do electronic commerce, must align with and choose to voluntarily implement if they want to process those systems or have access to the electronic payment systems through the common consortium of credit card companies that are behind PCI DSS. So if you want to take and process MasterCard, Visa, American Express, etc., transactions, you must essentially follow those guidelines. But that's because they have, as an industry, come together, all those vendors, and said, this is how we want you to do it. And if you want to use our systems, you're going to follow our guidelines. But the federal government of the United States hasn't come out and said, yeah, you got to do PCI DSS or else. It's a federal law. Quite the opposite. They have nothing to say about it. It's a trade group attempt to be able to regulate their sector, and it makes good common sense, and it's a great set of standards, and it makes a lot of businesses much more safe with regards to processing your data. But it's not a legal requirement. And so there's all these different things, right, that go into the mix with regards to enterprise security architecture. As a CEH, you would be expected to understand some of these things. We're going to show you some websites with some of these in just a minute, but we're going to, have you as a CEH be on the lead, be on the point, on the end of the spear here, to be able to help a business understand how to be aligned, how to implement secure guidance, how to create awareness among the people that are going to consume that knowledge. Both internal and external customers have to be treated the same and have to be given the opportunity to be able to access security awareness, training, and find information when necessary, right? These would all be elements of the kind of plan or the kind of system that Mike may suggest to put through. We have to think about performing risk assessments. We have to identify assets. We have to understand how to be cost effective in our protection. So we have to be dollar aware. Right? It's very important. We can't just go out and say, buy the $1 million system to solve the $5 problem. I mean, we may be able to, depending on who we work for, but it's not a good idea. It doesn't make good sense. It's not exercising due diligence and due care to be effectively spending money for no good reason. And the reality is we have to be good stewards of the corporate resources. That's part of our job. We have to pay attention to all the threats that are out there and align our protection mechanisms accordingly. We have to detect and recover from security breaches. We have to go ahead and make sure we are monitoring continuously and assessing the state of our systems and the ability for them to respond. This is all part of the enterprise security architecture, part of the things that we need to build and we need to set up as information security professionals, as CEHs, in order to be able to do this. We have to think about using network zoning and the idea of creating protection enclaves and clearly carved out areas for certain kinds of behavior. We see this, for instance, with the use of a web browser like Internet Explorer, where we have the different security zones, right, that are going to be able to we see the most darndest things in the chat window from time to time. I like that one a lot. Crazy, stupid, nonsensical, named acronyms. Oh, that's awesome. I like that a lot. And trademark. That's even better. That's cool. So, we have to be thinking about the fact that when you go in, can you pull up, you've got that crazy non-Windows-based browser on your computer there, sir?
I do.
Can you, you won't be able to see it though, will you? Because you don't have the right thing. Sure. Can we go to my lab PC? Is that possible? I know we said in theory that was going to work. Oh, look at that. That is so awesome. So when we go in, and let me just pull up Internet Options here for a second. Just give me a second to kind of smooth and move that over there. All right. So when we go in, and we take a look at security, if we could maybe zoom in for a second. Is that possible? That's all me, isn't it? No, that's you. Oh, awesome. Thank you very much, because I have no idea how to zoom in on this PC without blowing everything up in the process. So when you look at what I'm showing you here, just a quick reference to this idea of zoning, right, and the use of zones. You can implement this a lot of different ways, right? We can have the internet zone. We could have the non-internet zones. We could have the DMZ zone. We could have internal, external, all these different things. But in the Internet Explorer, at least in this piece of software, we can see that we implement this exact thought process, right? We have the internet zone, we have the local intranet zone, we have the trusted sites, restricted sites. We have different ways of looking at process and system isolation with regards to that, right? And with regards to being able to apply that concept. And so we just want to be thinking about the idea behind that, right? And just thinking about what that may look like. Network security can exist in lots of different places, in other words, right? And we just want to be thinking about the zoning concept and how we can apply that as a certified ethical hacker. How can we make recommendations about the enterprise security architecture that help us to take advantage of this, right? And web services are definitely one of those ways to do that. Not the only way, by the way, but certainly one of the ways. We could look at physical architecture. Creating a DMZ is a physical design choice we make. We may implement it physically or logically or both. We just have to think about that, right? Could be one machine with multi-homed systems, essentially. You've got multiple network cards that logically create connections to different networks through one system. We could do that with subnets, with VLANs, with lots of different ways logically to isolate or physically isolate. So we have different ways of doing this, but all of this comes back to the idea of defense in depth, and we've spoken about this before. This would also be part of what Mike was talking about with his security awareness and training program. We'd want to instill in everybody a sense of defense in depth awareness. Not that they, as individual users, have to go out and build defense in depth systems. That's our job as protectors and as monitors and as owners and caretakers of the security apparatus and the essential guardians of the enterprise security architecture. But we do have to make everybody who uses those systems aware of the fact that there are multiple layers of defense. So in some of the demos we'll do in upcoming episodes, we'll be on a Windows platform, on a Linux platform, whatever it is. On the Windows platform, we'll perhaps shut down Windows Defender or Microsoft Security Essentials so it doesn't see a lot of the tools we're going to use in demo for you as malware and hacking software, which it could very well see them as, so that it doesn't take remediative steps to remove them before we can actually use them. That's a conscious choice we're going to make in the environment to essentially manipulate it so we can illustrate or show you something. In the real world, there wouldn't be a compelling reason for you to give users the right to shut that software off. That would be a bad idea. And that would be something that from a defense in depth posture would make no sense. Yet users have that right unless you take it away from them, right? Can we go back to the demo, the test machine rather, lab machine here for just a minute? Thank you very much. It's not hard to do, right? If you go in and you go to the control panel, right? And you go to, this is Windows 10, by the way. You go to System and Security. We'll just go here, and we can go in, and we can go, for instance, to the Windows Firewall, right, as I'm sure you're well aware. And we can come in and just turn the Windows Firewall on or off as just simply putting a little button in that particular, or a little radio selection in that button right there. If we have Windows Defender or Microsoft Security Essentials or whatever installed, we could turn it off very easily just by going in and clicking on a button. So, I mean, it's not hard with administrative rights to a PC to upend the enterprise security architecture. And we have to keep in mind that, unfortunately, in many of our systems, we give the average user full admin rights to the desktop because we're too lazy and or too uneducated to understand how to install software and deal with other issues without giving them full admin rights. And yes, I did say that. Yes, I am calling everybody out there out who doesn't know better. Right? You guys should not do that, and you know that you're doing something wrong, yet you allow it to continue. And this is the kind of ethical behavior we're talking about. Due care and due diligence is not just about making sure you're up to date with patches. It's about acting responsibly and acting ethically and making sure at all times that we're risk adverse and we are risk aware in what we do. And I don't want to stand up on my soapbox, although I would be taller than Mike if I did, but I just want you to know, right, that ultimately, if you see this behavior occurring and you allow it to propagate and continue in your networks, you're not building a defense in depth enterprise security architecture that's focused on preventing attacks. You're opening up a major security hole and liability and acknowledging a risk and ignoring it in your architecture that can propagate attacks. The vulnerability we would identify is escalation of privilege and oversubscription or overuse of administrative rights. If users can go in and derail security policy by shutting off software that gets in their way, that's not a good architecture as far as I'm concerned. That's an administrator error or an administrative error in oversight, and that's not something that should happen. There are compelling, legitimate reasons why you may need to do that, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that there are not cases where that may not be, or rather may be, the only legitimate way to go. But you better then show me that you've documented that risk, that somebody above you in a position of senior management has been acknowledging that risk, has signed off on it, in other words, and communicated effectively with them what the implications of that risk is. And when I come to audit you, and this is the question I ask my customers all the time when I audit, hey, you've got exceptions? Great. Where are they? Let me see them. Because if I find them and you don't have them documented, I'm failing you on your audit because they're unacknowledged risks, and you don't pass an audit with unacknowledged risks. If you have them, let's be upfront about them. Tell me what they are. I may not like them. I may tell you I think that they're inappropriate, but if you've got documentation that shows me you've identified them, somebody in senior management has signed off on them, and you're operating the business with full knowledge, okay, you've done everything that I would want you to do from a controls perspective, short of mitigating that risk by applying a compensating preventive or detective control, but you've documented it, and you've told me that you're ignoring it, and one of the 4 legitimate ways to deal with risk is to either accept risk, which is what you're doing, to avoid it, right? To mitigate it, minimize it, and or to transfer it. If you're going to accept it, then just make sure you've got all your ducks in a row. And we may not like it, but guess what? I don't have to sleep in your bed at night and worry about your risk. I don't work for your company. When it blows up, I'm not going to be the one who has to fix it. But I am going to be the one who's going to say, wow, how did you let that happen if you don't have a documented risk that you've accepted? If we accept it, I'm going to be the one who says, yep, no, we knew that was an issue, understood that it could happen, let's just go about fixing it because we accepted the price of doing business by accepting the risk. In other words, there's no I told you so. We're not looking to blame anybody. We're just looking to make sure the right people have said yes, so that when it does happen, we understand that those people knew that this was a possibility. Because then there should not be any blame. There should simply be a remediation strategy that has to go into effect. Right? It's very important to think about that, right? We have a quick question. Can you tell us if we need to install any software, VMs, OSs for the rest of the week? Thanks. Oh, absolutely. We can answer that. I thought it was actually a question related to what we're talking about here. There is no need for any of you out there listening to any of our episodes, by the way, with regards to CEH, to install anything per se. If you want to, as we're doing demos, as we will do in later episodes, follow along. We'll always tell you what the tool is that we're going to use, give you a quick idea of what we've done to set it up. At the beginning of that, we'll kind of give you a sense of where we went to build the VMs or how we built them. We're going to use some pre-made VMs that we're going to use to demo. One will be a Kali Linux VM. We'll use a couple of Windows VMs, all networked together. But you'll be able to see us do stuff. But no reason for you to have to do anything to follow along. We'll describe what we're going to do. And if you decide you want to reproduce that environment, there will be some guidance along the lines of just what to do and how we did it that you can access and download. But we'll tell you what tools we're using and where to find them if you're interested. But that'll be up to you. But nothing required from us other than that per se. At least nothing right now anyway. I may change my mind if Mike pisses me off. But for now, we're not going to not have you do anything. But we've talked about the importance of policies and the different kinds of requirements that policies speak to in the organization. Can't stress enough just how important policies are and why we need them. What kind of policies? Policies for everything and anything. We may have access control policies, user account policies, special access, firewall management. You name it, there's all sorts of policies. Can you take us on a little road trip on the web? This is going to be one we didn't plan for. Okay. Let me just tell Mike where we're going to go before we switch to his machine. Give him a second to bring this up. Can you go to the SANS reading room, bring up the policy site, the one you and I have been to before with all the templates? We'll give Mike just a second to get there before we demo that. What we want to show you is one of the places you can go to get policy templates if you need them. One of the biggest challenges when I was starting out over 30 years ago now doing this, back in the 1980s, been a long time, it's close to 40 years now that I've been doing this. But when you go out and you think about, back in the 80s when I started having to do this and I got into this field, there was not the kind of resources that we have today. The internet did not exist the way it does today. The resources we're going to show you did not exist. They were not there. And one of these resources, the one that Mike has up right now, is one that is great because it gives you unbiased, fettered information that's not linked to any vendor. This is just information that's available through a great organization, one of many out there that does a lot of great work in our community, essentially passing around information, making it available to all information security professionals. SANS, if you're not familiar with them, you definitely should take a look at their site. One of the things they do is they have in the reading room in some of the areas they have an information security policy template site. You can download policy templates in a variety of areas in both Word and PDF format for free. All you have to do is click on the appropriate item, download the template, it's cut and paste, it has a insert company name here kind of thing, and you put your company name in, and you can get a template for free on like 40 or so of the most common policies you may have to write. When I started doing this years ago, nobody came to me and said, hey, here's a 5-page template, all you got to do is put your name in, and it's ready to go. Somebody said, hey, you got to write this thing, and by the way, we want it tomorrow morning.
From scratch. Yeah.
Yeah, and back then, we were using chisels and rocks, like you see in the old Flintstone cartoons. Well, let me take your picture in the car. The bird's in there chiseling it out. Nobody had this stuff. And if you had it, you didn't give it to anybody, right? Because you knew what a pain in the ass it was to make it, and you kept it for yourself, right? So, the reality is back in the old days, it was a lot tougher to be an information security professional. Today, we make it a lot easier for you to find this stuff. So this is one of those that's going to be very helpful for you with regards to policies. I get asked all the time, hey, I'm just starting out. How do I write a policy? I know the concept. I just don't really know what to do. How do I start? What does it look like? And that's tough if you've never done one before, right?
Absolutely.
And if somebody gives you a little hint and pushes you in the right direction, then that's great. It's better for you. It's better for all of us in the community. It's better for your business. Everybody wins. You got better policies. Your company's going to be better protected, and ultimately everybody wins. So there's no reason not to share this information with you out there. So, make sure you're aware of that, right? We got to go out and create a good policy. What are the steps involved? It's very important to think about the steps involved with creating a policy. You've got the template there, but what's the thought process behind this? Let's quickly talk about it. You got to go out and do a risk assessment, first of all, to figure out what it is you want to identify that may need a policy to associate. You got to then go out and look for what standards and guidelines may already exist. Oh, I need a policy that deals with electronic records management in the healthcare industry. I'm involved with healthcare in the United States. I know there's this law called HIPAA. I got to figure out how to manage that. I've done a risk assessment and I've got some sort of exposure with confidential records from various patients. I got to deal with that. Are there standards, are there guidelines out there that I have to look to? Absolutely. There's a 400-page piece of legislation, or probably 1,000 pages or more, that you can look at with guidance, right? That's going to help you to understand that. We got to take a look at and talk to senior management. Get them into the loop here. Nothing, and I repeat, absolutely nothing will ever take place in your world if you do this the right way without buy-in and without information and awareness on the part of senior management inside the organization. As I catch my hair because it is getting caught. I'm doing this and it's like dragging me this way because it's what happens when you have long hair and you don't put it back in a ponytail. Shame on you. You're supposed to remind me to do that before he's falling down on the job, Mr. Mike. So we got to get senior management involved. As a matter of fact, I want you all out there to raise your hand right now. You're going to do this with me. So Can we go to a wide shot?
Yep.
We're going to take an oath. So we're going to raise our
right, left.
Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure it's because on the camera it's the opposite way. Left, we're going to put our left hand up, and all of you are going to take an oath with me. You're all going to promise to do the following. I insert your name.
I insert my name.
Just like in Animal House, right? I insert my name. I, whatever you are, whoever you are, do solemnly promise.
Do solemnly promise.
Notice I did not say swear, because swearing's not nice.
No, it's not.
Do solemnly promise to always.
To always.
Always.
Always. To always.
Stress.
Always.
Always. Right?
Always.
Underline. Always. To always include.
Always include.
Senior management.
Senior management.
In any. And all.
And all.
Conversations. About security.
About security.
Period. End of sentence.
Period. End of sentence.
Right? It's very important because if you don't pursue this with senior management, you are not following the proper procedures. You are not following what we would consider to be best practices. And you are going to go off and make decisions that are not going to be supported by the organization necessarily. And that's a risk. And that can lead to vulnerability. And that can lead to potentially exposure and all sorts of bad things. You have to set clear penalties if those policies that you're going to create are not followed. What are the expectations and what are the, essentially the violations that can occur, and how do we deal with them? We have to make sure the final version of the policy, whatever we write, is communicated out to everybody, is going to be available, put up on a SkyDrive, made available via email, sent to everybody, whatever it is. You got to do all that. We got to make sure that everybody reads, signs, and acknowledges that policy in some way or form. Could be online, could be part of the employee handbook when they start, it could be yearly review and refresher. There's all these different ways to do this. You have to make sure you have tools in place to employ the policy, deploy it, and ultimately to make sure that it is going to be implemented. So you got to be able to enforce the policy. So we have to think about monitoring and things like that. We have to be able to train everybody. We talked about training and awareness. And we have to review and update that policy on an ongoing basis. 9 steps, very, very important. Risk assessment. Validate the existing architecture and make sure that if there is guidance, we pay attention to it. Senior management buy-in. Set clear priorities and clear penalties in the policy so everybody understands what we're doing. Make sure the final version is communicated broadly and effectively to everybody. We're going to switch to this hand and start counting again over here. Read, sign, and understand the policy. Make sure everybody does that, right? Make sure we have tools in place to enforce the policy. Train employees and review and update regularly. Total of 9, right? Steps. Want to make sure we know what those are. Very, very important for us to be thinking about them and to understand the steps involved so that we can walk through that and in our mind be aware of that. How do we deal with things like physical security, right? Who's coming in? Where are they coming from? How do we deal with network-based security? Who's communicating? Who's connecting? How do we deal with information traffic flow? DLP, data loss prevention, what's going through our systems. These are all places where we may want to think about defense in depth architecture, and we may want to think about the kinds of things that we have to do and the kind of policies we have to create. With a physical security area, And a focus, we may want to think about, entry and exit controls, right? Who's coming in the door? Under what circumstances? Do we know who they are or where they're coming from, for instance, right? That would be important. We want to be thinking about ingress and egress, access control, all sorts of stuff that may come up that we may want to think about and also write policies around. We have to think about incident management and the ways in which we can deal with incidents when they occur. One of the most important things people do, or in this case don't do, depending on where they come from, is to understand that when something happens, and we'll talk a lot about this in upcoming episodes, that we clearly have a set of steps that have been documented and that we have trained on and that we follow to respond. In other words, we shouldn't just randomly run around screaming, oh my God, somebody hacked into Mike's computer, or, why is Mike's computer doing all this crazy stuff? We have a virus, or who knows what, right? Whatever can happen. We have to think about the fact that we have a clearly articulated set of steps that we can follow, and we have to understand that we call that an incident management process. And there's a set of steps that are documented, well thought out, that go into most incident management processes. Let's quickly talk about what they are. We have to think about and prepare for incident handling and response, of course. So step one is kind of preparation, right? Think about all the things we'd have to do ahead of time. Who are the members of the team that we're going to call on? Do we pre-position some resources? Do we have maybe a potential forensic examination capability that we contract with outside the organization so we could call on it? Things that we would do to plan, right? Then we have to detect and analyze. So we have to think about what went on and essentially how to understand it, whatever it may be, right? We have to classify and prioritize what we're finding. So we have to understand it in some way to be able to look at Mike's machine and go, yep, that looks like malware, as opposed to that looks specifically like a Trojan of this type or this kind, or it's a rootkit, or it's not any of those things. It's just somebody connecting in and using, a little stupid program to put a console message up or something like that. So we have to classify and prioritize. We have to notify who are the people involved that if we told there's a problem, and if so, under what conditions do we notify them? We have to focus on containment, step number 5, right? Stop that machine from being able to talk to others and stop the information that's on it from being spread, good or bad. We may unplug the network cable. We may take steps to isolate the machine. There's a lot of things we could do, but we probably don't want to turn the machine off. If we turn the machine off, we lose all the valuable evidence that is in there, and forensically, we may lose the opportunity to examine that machine and see what was going on with it. We will forensically examine it in step 6, eradicate and recover in step 7, get rid of all the things that may be going on in there, and in step 8, we have to deal with post-incident activities. We have to go in and actually figure out how to prevent that from happening again. We may take steps to change the baseline. We may go in and we should and we will hopefully do a lessons learned or a post-implementation review. Project management is called a PIR, or a post-mortem, or a lessons learned review, where we examine the incident, trying to see what went wrong and learn what we can do differently after the fact. We want to take advantage of all those things, right? And think about them. Vulnerability assessments may be important here, and pen tests may be important as well. We did talk about some of the legal sites and things that we wanted to. I just know quickly as we wrap up, wanted to maybe show you just a couple of websites that will help us to understand the framing of these kind of conversations. I mentioned a bunch of them already. I mentioned PCI DSS. You could see on the screen in front of you that we have the generic PCI DSS website, the portal, I believe, entering into the discussion about PCI DSS 3.02 or 3.2, the newest version right now, the download link for that. You always want to check these websites and make sure you have the most recent version. That was version 3.01 not that long ago. It recently went through another revision. And there's an interesting conversation there about the slight updates and the alignment and realignment as we go. But you want to make sure you're aware of PCI DSS standards, as we said. What's up next there on the list? That one is the Sarbanes-Oxley website, if I'm not mistaken, right? So some information about Starbucks. And in the United States, if you are a business here that is publicly traded and is on the stock exchange or listed, you have legal responsibilities and financial responsibilities under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act here in the United States, and you're essentially monitored by and regulated by the federal government. So you have to follow the steps and the guidance laid out under Sarbox. You would want to be aware of that. If you are dealing with the healthcare industry in the United States, the HIPAA Act is going to be important for you. The HHS.gov website, which you can see there for health information privacy, would be a starting point for you in terms of reference and information about not only the standard and the activities allowed, but guidance and tool sets and all sorts of things you may use and find there as an information security professional. Very important. And we got some ISO standards up there somewhere. We could do CSA next, that's fine. Cloud Security Alliance, something we'll talk about and come back to again when we get into cloud computing and discussions of cloud computing and hacking later on in some of the upcoming episodes. But the Cloud Security Alliance, great group, just like SANS, just like PCI. A lot of information out there from different areas. They have something called the Cloud Controls Matrix, which is a spreadsheet that brings together a lot of the guidance we're talking about in all these other areas, aligns it so you could see the control element and all the different references to how it's implemented in all these different frameworks across the board. So if you want to apply a control for identity and access management using dual factor authentication under ISO 27002, the CCM, the Cloud Controls Matrix, tells you what that looks like there, but also what it looks like for application or for the use of that control in about 40 different information security frameworks around the world simultaneously. Wow. So it's a really valuable resource, one you can definitely take a look at as well. We've got the ISO, a couple of the ISO standards there. The interesting thing about the ISO standards, almost without exception, all of them are going to require that you purchase them. So you have to understand that this may be something your company chooses to do to be aligned, and there's typically a cost associated with ISO certification formally, but you have to pay usually a couple $100 US to get the standards. But you can see an abstract of them online. And so when you go to the main landing page, the library here, you get a little summary, and then as Mike clicked on the preview ISO IEC 27000 whatever standard, it takes you out to the library where you can see the overview, you can see the table of contents, typically the preface, and usually some of the information about it. But then if you want to see the whole thing, you have to actually buy the standard. And he's just scrolling through and showing you some of that there. So you just want to make sure you're aware of that you have a sense of those kind of things. We mentioned ISO 15408, which is the common criteria standard. You don't have that one up, and that's fine. But there's all these different ones that we could look at. Do you have the NIST government site, the main NIST SP site? You could bring up, Michael, just go out and search for the NIST SP, the special publications site. There's a bunch of different guidance that NIST puts out as well. Also very important for you to be aware of and to think about. All these different areas, all these different focal points will become critical for you, and definitely things that from, again, a toolkit and an assessment perspective, you would probably want to think about and probably just want to make sure you're aware of. Very, very important for us to, again, build out our knowledge and to have these different levers that we can pull and to access.
All right, Adam, another great look at some of the information we need to establish and be familiar with as we move on through our CEH, look at information security controls, or at least where we can find information about the controls that we might or might not want to implement. Also take a look at information security laws and some of the standards that are available that we can go out there and get, and some great look at places like SANS where we can, if we have to write policies, we don't know where to start. There's templates available. The point is there's resources out there. We as CEH just need to be aware that they're out there and know where to go to find them. So we thank you for that, Adam. Appreciate it. Hope everybody out there enjoyed watching. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I'm Mike Roderick.
I'm Adam Gordon.
And we'll see you next time.